Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Robin Mason. I'm with Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, and I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. Before we get started, I quickly want to go over some general housekeeping information. As I've mentioned before, your phone lines are muted. That's only to help with distraction from background noise when we get a number of people on the phone at the same time. But please feel free to use that chat box over on the left-hand side of your screen if you have any technical questions. If you're having trouble hearing any of the presenters, we can try to get that figured out if you let us know in the chat box. And during the presentation, if you have questions for the presenters, please feel free to type those in the chat box also. We may not pass them along right away, but we do have a record of them, and we will be able to get to them at the end of the presentation, or we may be able to follow up with you via email to respond to your question. Do want to mention also we are recording this session, so you can feel free to go back and view that at a later date if you want to revisit the information or if there's other members of your team that you think might help find the information helpful. And you will see a link at the end of this webinar where you can access all of the recordings. So again, thank you all so much for joining us today, and I'm now going to go ahead and pass this over to GFAS Executive Director, Kelly Heckman.
Thank you, Robin. Oh, am I echoing again? Okay, no. So yeah, my name is Kelly Heckman, and I'm the Executive Director of GFAS. And I'd just like to welcome everybody to our second webinar in our four-part series focused on avian adoption. And this is, as Robin mentioned, sponsored by GFAS and co-organized with Avian Welfare Coalition. So GFAS is an international accreditation organization for those of you who aren't familiar with us. And as part of our accreditation program, we recognize excellence among sanctuaries and rescue groups, but also want to engage with those that are non-accredited to improve the care of animals, public safety, and sustainability of organizations. For us, our objective in sponsoring these series of webinars is to provide you with the necessary information for helping you with short-term care issues for birds that come to you in need. And from previous avian-focused webinars, we've provided that information and heard a lot of feedback from you that you wanted to know more information about adoption. And that inspired us to create this adoption focus series. And so today we're going to be specifically addressing your questions that you've sent us during your registration process on how to educate adoptive caregivers on avian issues. Oops. So before we dive into that in a little bit more detail, I just want to remind you that as part of our accreditation, we actually have a set of 24 different species-specific animal care standards, and that includes 4 focused on avian groups. And so you can feel free to go to our website and download those standards of care for you to review. We also have a list of accredited sanctuaries that include those specifically focused on avian care that you might be able to communicate with to address any specific avian care needs. And then we also have a webpage specifically devoted to avian education, including the list of all the different series presentations that we've done in the past. This is the 3rd series that we've done, and you can access all those recorded webinars on our website as well. We also recommend going to a variety of other resources to get more information about avian issues, such as our co-organizers on these webinars, Avian Welfare Coalition, and then also ASPCA Pro and animalsheltering.org, who provide a lot of really great resources as well. So in this situation, because everybody's so interested in adoption, we actually have a lot of questions to get to today, but that doesn't mean that you should not, as Robin mentioned, participate. If we're talking about something and you want us to elaborate or it inspires a related question, please ask, and that makes this more valuable for you, which is absolutely why we're doing it. So with that, I want to introduce, again, our co-organizer for these webinar series, Denise Kelly is the president and co-founder of the Avian Welfare Coalition, and I'm going to hand it over to her to address a few issues with you as well.
Oh, thank you very much, Kelly, and please everyone could join us, and I'd like to express my appreciation to Kelly and Robin for their work on these webinars. So pleased to have the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries as our partner to present these webinars to you. The Avian Welfare Coalition formed back in 2000 to create a voice in the animal protection community for captive birds, and one of our goals was to expand resources to help birds in need. And we felt that reaching out to the animal protection community was a very crucial part of that, and to utilize the expertise and infrastructure that they had in place. But what we really wanted to do was provide them with specific tools to enable them to serve birds. Our avian shelter outreach program provides those resources online, and we also work with the Global Federation to present these webinars. For this latest series, as Kelly said, we drew upon the input we received to our previous 2015 webinars and the earlier ones this year. So these are what you want to know more about, and we got the experts to do that. And I'd like to introduce today's experts. First is Lorelei Tibbetts, who is the practice manager at the Center for Avian and Exotic Medicine in New York. Lorelei has a BS in veterinary technology and has worked exclusively with exotic pets since 2003. She's also an adjunct teacher of avian and exotic medicine at a New York-based veterinary technology program and a frequent speaker at national veterinary symposiums. Lorelei is also the founding member and current president of the Vet Tech Specialty Group of the Academy of Veterinary Technicians in Clinical Practice. I might add that she recently received a nice award of recognition, Veterinary Technician of the Year by the New York State Association of Veterinary Technicians. Janet Trumbule is the Executive Director of Administration of the Oasis Sanctuary, and she's been there since March 2010. Janet oversees the organization's financial and administrative functions, as well as manages the direct care provided to, and correct me if I'm wrong, the 800 plus birds in residence. Does that sound about right?
Just under 800.
And prior to joining the Oasis, Janet worked in the financial industry for 30 years, and I'm sure she's bringing a lot of that experience to the management there. And she actually has been involved with parrot welfare since 1979 when she acquired her first bird. With that, I'd like to turn it back to Kelly.
Great. Well, yeah, so as you can see, we've got some great experts that are going to talk about a variety of topics today, which include adoption education, health and wellness, social and enrichment, flight, and then household safety. And these are all, again, in the framework for how you would present this information to potential adopters. So our first question that we want to address, what kind of education process should we be doing for new adopters? And I'm going to ask both speakers to name their top 3 issues when it comes to this. And we'll start with Janet.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. It's great to be with you today. So I considered the top 3 in my book, and really it's basic information that we need to give adopters. Think about the first time you got a bird. What did you not know? What did you need to learn? So I think a lot of groups who do classes, it's a wonderful opportunity to get into some really basic information about all birds. And then possibly if you have an opportunity to do some one-on-one work with an adopter and the bird that they're interested in, then you could probably get into more specific information about that species or that particular bird. But generally, I think adopters really need to learn basic anatomy and health of a bird How do they know when a bird is ill? So signs of illness, droopy eyes. Of course, droppings are a key sign. We look at a lot of droppings, as you all know. And so learning what a proper dropping should look like versus one of an ill bird is something that is very easy to teach and a good sign of illness. A good diet, sleep requirements for birds are really important, important factors that a new adopter should understand. Secondly, environment and enrichment. I notice that many of you do home visits, so you may have an idea of an environment that the bird would go into, proper cage sizes and aviary opportunities, things like that. If you aren't doing home visits, maybe then giving some better guidelines on what is appropriate for the type of bird that you are looking to adopt would be helpful. And enrichment opportunities, and we'll get into more detail about that later, but that's a key point to make sure that bird continues to thrive and remains happy. And then thirdly, I think behavior and anything around behavior with that particular species of bird, but in general body language and maybe hormonal or breeding behavior that they may not be familiar with. Some people think it's very abnormal when a bird starts to regurgitate, when we know that that's a normal process of the part of the breeding process. So having an adopter understand those things before they see it is very helpful. And I think most importantly, letting adopters know that there are no silly questions. Again, things that we never knew when we brought in a bird. You probably felt embarrassed about asking if that was a normal behavior, but letting them know that we're here to help, and then nothing is silly or crazy, that it's probably a normal behavior and they just need to understand what's going on. So Lorelei, you have some additional information?
Well, some of the things I think may be helpful, so I work in a veterinary hospital, and I know when I'm adopting birds to people, I spend a lot of time teaching them all of the things that Janet just talked about, but so therefore I think one thing you guys could do is guide people towards good avian veterinarians, because we're a huge resource for people who need information. And depending on the kind of shelter you work at, you may yourselves not even know exactly how to teach a potential adopter all of the things that they need to know, or perhaps you don't have the time to do that. So something that you could do is, sort of passing the buck a little bit, but saying, hey, you need an avian veterinarian anyway, go there, get the information that they can give you. And I also did want to mention one of my favorite resources when even I don't have the time that I need to teach people everything they need to know, because there really is so much involved in caring for these animals, is sending them to some of my favorite online resources. I particularly like lefebervet.com. It's LAFEBER, for those of you who aren't aware of what it is. They have a lot of free different webinars that they have recorded, some different slideshows, papers. Some of it is medical in nature. Some of it is a little more than clients would need, but a lot of it is really basic, fantastic information about a basic anatomy, basic behavioral things. And I think it's a great place to send people to get that information. And for you guys who maybe need more information yourselves on how to care for these animals and some of the basic, most important things you need to know.
Great. We'll move to the next question. What are some of the unique challenges of life with a parrot, or I'll extrapolate other companion birds, versus a dog or a cat that we should share with adopters without scaring them off? And I'll give this to Lorelei first.
Well, I think one of the things I would say is I actually kind of like scaring people off, because I think too many people are impulse buyers or impulse adopters. I mean, I can speak from experience. When I was 18 years old in college, one of the first things I did as an adult on my own is I went out and bought a Sun Conure. I'm embarrassed to say that now because I didn't know anything at the time, and we don't want people to do that. I didn't know that they were extremely loud, that they could be mean and bite, and all I knew was they were really pretty. So I do like scaring people. I think as far as challenges with life of a parrot, for those of you who don't know, I tell people all of the bad things. I tell them about the mess that, there's not only feather dander, but food thrown everywhere. The requirements for their feeding go way beyond just a seed mix or opening a dog or a cat food can or something like that. They need fresh fruits, fresh vegetables. They need bird-specific things. They need space to come out of a cage. You have to, quote, bird-proof your home, which I think we get into a little bit later. They may not need to get walked like a dog, but they certainly do need a lot of your time and attention. And there's so many challenges as far as, I know for myself, one of the things I wasn't very prepared for in owning birds was the guilt factor, which is when you have a bird, especially if you only have one, and maybe you want to go away for overnight or for a weekend and you can't bring your bird with you, but you don't necessarily need to hire a pet sitter, or you don't want to bring it to a boarding facility, or even if you just want to go out after work and not come home until late at night. Sometimes I started feeling like, oh my gosh, my bird's home alone in a cage. It's a terrible feeling. And I think people with cats probably don't experience that in the same way. And financially, and I know I talk to adopters a lot about money because, again, I work at a vet hospital, and people are never prepared for what it costs to take care of birds. They just don't think that a bird is going to cost the same, let alone more, because we are specialists, than a dog or a cat vet. So they come in with their cockatiel and they don't realize that they're going to have significant expense if the bird is sick. And if people can't afford it, I literally tell people, hey, if you were to come back next year and your bird has a broken wing and I tell you it's going to be $1,600 for surgery to fix it, can you afford that? If the answer is no, I don't adopt a bird to them. So I think scaring them off is sometimes the right thing. I don't know if Janet agrees with me completely on that, but it's something that I try to kind of use as a tool for determining who really is a good potential adopter.
Janet, did you have anything that you wanted to contribute there?
Well, yes, I'll add on to that. I don't disagree. Certainly we don't want to scare off people that who could really be good bird owners and provide a loving home for a bird in need. But I do think that being honest about life with a bird is really important. And as Lorelei said, most of the time when people start to hear what it's really like, either they will commit or they'll back off and find other interests. So, I think just a couple other key points that I would share is really the lifespan of a bird. Even an adopter of a cockatiel, if it's a young bird and that bird could live to be 30 years old, if you can really get people to focus on the next 30 years of their life, they may realize this is not the pet for them or the companion that they had hoped they could have. I had a cockatiel for 30 years, and when I think back on my life with that bird, boy, did he go through a lot with me. And, I was committed to keeping him through all my life changes, but not everybody can. So that's really very important to get people to think about. Young people who aren't married or who want to get married and have children or travel, those are all things that might impact their decision. And then my second most important part is I think getting people or an adopter to understand that when they take home their new bird, that it may take some time for that bird to gain their trust. A cat or dog is probably going to be in their lap that night, cuddling and loving on that person, but a bird, it could take months, it could take years, depending on that bird's life situation. So I think that's really important for adopters to be aware of, that there would be some work involved in gaining that bird's trust and having it become a good companion pet.
Yeah, very good points. sorry. Any tips, and I know this is a very broad topic, so maybe just your top couple tips on how best to match a potential adopter's personality and lifestyle to certain species or individual birds. And I know, again, it's broad, but maybe, Janet, if you want to start, if you had some tips.
Sure, I have just some key points. There's lots of things we can consider, and of course you're going to get to know an adopter over time, but certainly looking at their lifestyle. So a person who works and travels a lot, a cockatoo probably isn't the best bird for them. They tend to need a lot more attention, and so having the human out of the home will probably be detrimental to their health and their existence. So just, when you look at lifestyle of the adopter and the needs of each individual species, and there's some species that do very well and are more independent and can live longer on their own, so to speak. But lifestyle certainly is an important aspect to look at. Individuals that live in condos or apartments, noise factor is the big thing. So you think big birds, that would be a problem, but there are small birds like sun conures who make a lot of noise and constant noise that could be very disturbing to close neighbors. So I think considering, the housing arrangement and where that bird will be, and, if they're going to be vocalizing normally, will that impact neighbors that could have problems with that? Another really important point is considering individuals with allergies, asthma, any respiratory issues should not adopt birds that have feather dander or feather dust, so cockatoos, African grays, cockatiels. Ultimately, they're going to have to give up their birds for health reasons, and I can tell you that I see that a lot with birds coming to sanctuary. It's not really the birds necessarily the problem, but the owners have medical issues and just can't continue to keep the bird in the home. So those are some of the key points I would touch on.
Right. Lorelei?
Those are all really great points. I would probably also add maybe people's financial situations. There's some, certainly I spend a lot more money on my macaw as far as toys, food, things like that, rather than my, the smaller birds, budgies and cockatiels and things like that. And maybe just getting to know people's personalities a little bit. I think that, some birds suit certain personalities better. Some of the more quieter Pyonis type parrots might be better suited for a quiet person. I tend to be a loud person, so I actually am very attracted to the loud birds. I love singing and dancing and screaming with them, but other people may not be that into that kind of a bird. So it really is important to get to know who your potential adoptees are a little bit before letting them take a bird.
Great. Well, moving into health and wellness, and I'm going to, since Lorelei has a medical background, I'll let her kind of focus in on some of these health and wellness questions. How often do you advise that adopters bring their birds in for a well bird exam, and what goes into a well bird exam?
So I think the most important thing for shelter people to know would be to ensure that people go to a vet at the very beginning. It's by far the most important exam. Like I mentioned, these birds these people are going to be needing a little extra education, assuming that perhaps the shelter wasn't able to do the complete education they'll need. So hopefully the vet will be able to fill in the blanks. I noticed somebody put a question up or a comment about just because a vet sees birds doesn't necessarily follow that the vet is an avian vet, and that is very true. There's a difference between a board certified avian veterinarian, somebody who has pursued and achieved board certification, versus a veterinarian who likes birds and sees them. Not that those people can't do a decent job, just people should recognize there's a difference in probably the education of those veterinarians. So what I recommend is they should have this first initial bird exam when they're adopted, and what goes into that well bird exam is obviously the physical exam is the most important part. We do when I recommend annual checkups therein and after, I think a lot of times people say, well, what am I going to bring my bird in for? He's perfectly healthy. He's fine. Well, a lot of times, especially a board-certified avian vet is going to be able to recognize subtle changes that maybe you're not going to understand or recognize at home. We do, like any other animal, eyes, ears, nose, throat. We can recognize changes in the eye, behind the eye. We look at the body conformation and make sure there isn't significant weight loss or weight gain. We make sure there's no abnormalities with the feathers or the preen gland. We're able to do grooming and all the physical needs. And these are all really important for birds, I believe, on an annual basis, but certainly that first time is the most important. And then the most important part about what goes into these well bird exams, and I tell clients this all the time when I'm trying to encourage them to come in more regularly rather than just when there's a problem, is that we get to teach them things. We are constantly learning. We are constantly going to continuing education. Avian medicine is always changing. And when we learn, we teach our clients. We help them understand how to take better care of their birds, whether or not to trim their wings, how to exercise your bird better, all of the things that go into keeping your bird healthy for longer. And even if it's just a physical exam and a conversation for a half an hour, it's worth it for people, in my opinion, to do that on an annual basis, touch base with their vet, be a part, the vet gives the vet a chance to be a part of that bird's life and family and really be part of their long-term health plan.
Super. What medical testing do you recommend adopters do when bringing a new bird into their home, which I guess you kind of briefly touched on, but maybe a little more in detail? And what about quarantine? How long should adopters quarantine new adopted birds?
So medical testing that I would recommend the first time for any new bird that hasn't had these tests, especially if they're coming out of a shelter or sanctuary type environment where they were probably exposed to many other birds, definitely a baseline blood panel. I usually explain it to people like that it's the same kind of a test you'd have if you went to the doctor. We're going to be looking at a complete blood count, red and white blood cells. We're going to be looking at liver function, kidney function, cholesterol level. We're going to be looking at electrolytes just to get a baseline evaluation of what's happening internally. And there are some infectious diseases that can be passed and spread and lie dormant within birds that would be good to know if the bird has been exposed. It may or may not ever cause an illness in the bird, but it's certainly something I think clients have the right and should want to know to ensure their investment, to ensure they know what's happening with their new pet. So for me, it's a little species specific, and the way we do it at our practice is old world birds, cockatoos, African greys. Those birds we test for cytosine beak and feather disease, circovirus, which can cause problems with them. New world birds can get these diseases, certainly if they've been exposed to each other. But we do see it more in the old world species. And then every bird can benefit from a chlamydia test, also known as psittacosis. They used to call it parrot fever. There's 1,000 names for it, but it's not a virus. It's a bacterial infection that birds can kind of harbor and get sick with, especially in times of stress. And of course, adoption is, if nothing else, a very stressful time for a bird going into a new home. So these are the things, two of the basic tests we would recommend in addition to a baseline panel. I did also want to mention somebody put a post up saying their vet offers annual radiographs as well to differentiate internal organs. Vets practice medicine in different ways. X-rays are a fantastic way to get more information. A lot of times it requires sedation. I'm not a big fan of sedating any animal if they don't need it. I wouldn't recommend doing that annually if you have to sedate the bird or if it's extremely stressful for the bird. But of course, it's a fabulous diagnostic tool, especially if you suspect a problem. Quarantine is sort of tied into this, depending on the kind of birds you have and what birds you have at home. So if you are doing a proper quarantine, the idea is to not expose the new bird to existing birds for the length of time that any possible or predictive disease could take to manifest. And that time is considered to be 90 days. I don't, other than zoos, know of any facilities that are able to practice proper quarantine for this time because of space limitations. And most clients or potential adopters are not, they don't want to wait 90 days. They want to introduce the birds right away, or maybe they don't have the space to do that. So we definitely recommend, okay, let's do the baseline testing. Let's get an idea of the bird's health. Keep the bird quarantined for a minimum of a month, as long as clients are able to do that, and then consider a slow introduction to the flock. It really depends on the individual situation and whether or not they're going to allow or permit testing. If they are not going to be doing a vet visit or any diagnostic testing, 90 days really should be practiced, because within that time, if the bird doesn't break with an illness, they're probably okay. I think that's, scan these questions, but I think that's it.
Yeah, well,
so somebody,
go ahead.
Well, I didn't know if you want me to address some of these questions that people ask. Happy to if we have time, but I could also wait if you guys tell me.
I think let's see how far we can get in. And again, like for questions we don't get to now, if we have time at the end, we'll come back to them. And if we don't have time, then hopefully our presenters will be happy to address those questions and get those answers to you via email. But not to say that you shouldn't continue to ask those questions, but we just want to keep this trucking along a little bit. What are the signs of illness that adopters should be aware of? Janet mentioned earlier looking at the stool. Lorelei, do you have any?
Yeah, I think so. Definitely looking at the poop is a great way of understanding birds' health. You do need to be able to explain to clients what they're looking for as far as what's normal, because poop can vary, especially even throughout the day. If you give your birds some cherries and pomegranate, you don't want the adopter thinking it has bloody poop. So I usually just really quickly will tell people the poop is made up of 3 different parts. There's urine, that's clear. There's urates or uric acid, which is white, and there's feces, which is brown or sometimes green. You should be able to see all 3 of these in each poop. Diarrhea doesn't just mean a lot of urine or so a lot of times people say my bird has diarrhea, but when you actually are evaluating the poop, the stool itself, the fecal part is actually normal and formed, but really what they have is polyuria or excessive urination, which is of course a problem potentially, but it's a very different kind of problem. So I usually kind of give people that little bit of education, and then I have them just monitor what's normal for your bird. If you see significant change and that change is consistent, such as a foul odor, or true diarrhea, or true polyuria, or excessive urination, or severely dark stool to black can either mean digested blood, or it can mean that the bird is not eating. Those are problems. And of course, frank blood, red blood, that is obviously a significant sign of illness as well. So we do like people to be educated about poop and to look at it a lot. Other signs of illness, birds, they brought their bird in and they said, oh my God, he's just getting so fat, he's gaining weight, and really the bird is just fluffing their feathers, and underneath they're like emaciated little bones. And telling people and helping them understand that the feathers should, as a general rule, be sleek and plastered to the body, but when they're ruffled and fluffed for a prolonged period of time, that can be a sign of illness. Inability to perch or stand on their perches, drooping eyelids, excessive sleeping, any signs of unthrifty feathers, like they're not grooming themselves or preening themselves properly. Change in voice is another big one. We hear a lot of times, we'll notice that frequency of vocalization may have changed. And obviously appetite changes are a big thing. Anytime they notice that their birds are not consuming a normal amount of food, or even an excessive amount of food, could also be a sign of illness. I kind of like to just tell people that once you get to know your bird, any sign, any change in behavior could be something, or it could be nothing. As Janet said earlier, there are no silly questions. People send me videos all the time, and I'm like, oh, it's nothing. He's just being silly. And then they'll send me another video, and I'll say, hey, that's actually looks like a neurologic problem. Bring him in. I don't expect clients to necessarily know and be able to diagnose their own bird, but I do think they should be able to recognize a difference, a change, and ask us questions or ask their vet questions if they notice a change that could or could not be significant. So I do think it's really important to let them know, just to always ask. Again, develop a relationship with a veterinarian so that you can email them and ask them. I don't answer emails from people who are not clients of mine. They need to be someone we know already and have established a relationship with. So people should be made aware of that.
Right. And I also, as we transition, I believe, into the next section, that the first web series that we did with Avian Welfare Coalition was focused more on care. So if you all have any specific questions about care, some of these topics were covered in our earlier web series. So now we're going to transition. Again, lots of topics in this framework. Social enrichment. Should we encourage people to get more than one bird? Is it okay if they're different species? And I'll let Janet take this one.
Thank you. My thought is that this is a new adopter, and this person's not owned a bird before. I would highly recommend one bird only. There's going to be a lot to learn, and putting a second bird in the mix just might cause more frustration and angst for that new adopter. So especially if it's a bird that might have some behavioral challenges or even medical conditions. If you have a handicapped bird, we certainly want a new adopter to be more comfortable working with that one bird and getting to understand how to best care for that bird. And certainly if they have an interest down the road about adding a bird to their flock, then I would certainly consider that. One thing I am very pro is for bonded pairs. I never want to split up a bonded pair. When we get birds into the sanctuary, we make every effort to keep those birds together. Sometimes we find out that they're not really a bonded pair. Maybe in the home, what's the saying, love the one you're with. In the home, they're very what appears to be bonded to the bird they're with, but when they get around other birds, that can change. But if you do have a bonded pair and there's an adopter that's interested in that pair, I would say yes, then I would adopt two birds to that person just to keep the birds together. That will help those birds transition easier and certainly be happier in their life if they're with the one they love. And we do see pairs of bonded pairs with different species. As in this picture, we have a pair just like this at the sanctuary. And, as long as the adopter is comfortable taking the time to learn about the different species and address the needs of each of those birds, then I think it's a good place for the birds to go then. And of course, we want to do what's right for the birds.
Sure. What out-of-cage activities do you recommend when talking to adopters about enrichment? And just because we monopolized Lorelei for a while, I'll start with Janet again.
Well, I think the picture kind of says it all. We certainly don't want the birds coming into the home and trying to chew it down. So we want to give them activities that will engage them and give them opportunities to be active without pulling off the plaster on your walls and chewing your cabinets. So I think, certainly out-of-cage time is very important for every bird. If it's possible, it may take time to get a bird to that point comfortable to come out of its cage and interact with a family or their new adopter. So having a play area where the bird could go and know that that's a safe place is a good idea. A play stand, maybe it's the top of their cage where they can have toys, but certainly encouraging them to do out-of-cage activities is important. I am of the mind that, buying lots of bird toys is great, and spending lots of money on things that other people make is wonderful, but I really try and use activities around my home. I have a bird that loves to play under the sheets, so we do a lot of playing on the bed and just, playing in the blankets and the sheets. Using Tupperware lids and bowls and things like that to throw around and play with. Anything that I can find in my home that's safe and engaging for those birds is something that I look to do with the birds that I have here at home. So you have to be creative sometimes, and often on a play stand a bird may get bored and look to expand their horizons and venture out. And that's okay, but I think supervision and, again, finding areas that they can be in that would be safe and entertaining for them is important.
Great. And so we got a question, and I think it refers back to the paired species, but I think it's an important one. So the question is, but a dusty bird paired with the macaw, I have heard, can be a problem for the macaw's respiratory system. So I guess maybe not being so specific, but Lorelei, are there some certain species that would be, like, what are some considerations that would be bad pairings if we're doing a multi-species household?
It's funny because I have seen multiple pairs of African greys and macaws that these macaws do have respiratory problems. There has never been a clinical study proving that it's because of the African gray dander that makes them have these respiratory issues. So there's no real medical proof that it's an allergy or that it's hypersensitivity to the dander, but I'll tell you, it is a pretty big coincidence. I've seen it several times. So as a general rule, I do kind of, if somebody is thinking about that kind of a pair, it is something I would mention to them. That being said, there are macaws that live in homes with cockatoos and African greys and never have a problem. So it's one of those things. To me, the biggest concern is just safety. It's cute to see a large bird and a small bird, when they're cuddling, but it's not cute when the large bird bites the small bird in half. So I think as a general rule, safety needs to be the most important thing. But I have an Amazon that lives with Jen Day Conyer, and they're very happy together and cuddle all the time. So, and I wouldn't want to split them up. So I agree with Janet on that. Health-wise, there isn't a whole lot more to be said with pairing other than that has been mentioned.
Great. Are there certain types of toys that birds are most attracted to, referring to safety, or would you avoid some that adopters should avoid? Janet, you kind of spoke to some of the toys you use in your own personal household. Are there any that you would avoid?
Well, yeah, there are certainly lots of things to avoid, and especially if you're buying toys out of the retail market, you always want to make sure that the parts are safe, that there aren't little beads that big birds could swallow, or certainly what the contents of the toy are made of. So anything that might have certainly zinc or lead would be a problem. I think nowadays, most toys are much safer than they used to be, but there still are times when we find toys that I would consider unsafe. Painted toys, things that aren't vegetable dyed but painted. So certainly things like that you want to look for. Bells that might have small clappers that could come off, things like that. So just be very aware of the parts of toys that you might buy. And that holds true for anything in your house too. If you give your bird a remote control, a lot of people think, well, it's fun to watch them chew off the buttons, but what's inside? What can they get to inside that would be unsafe?
Yeah, I would add to that too. One of the things I really don't like and I try to discourage are those are basically anything that a bird could perceive as a nest, like those little happy huts or little circular fluffy things that birds like to climb into. It just stimulates reproductive behavior. I think we're going to touch on that later, but I really discourage that for birds in captivity, and try to avoid things, including even just birds that play in cabinets and go into drawers. I have a lot of clients say, "Oh, my bird lives in the kitchen cabinets." Well, that's cute and all, but they tend to think that's their nest. So I would avoid that kind of thing. And I have seen, from a medical perspective, many birds severely injured on toys. I've seen them get their heads stuck in inappropriately sized rings and can't get them out. I've seen clips get caught under the beaks that literally go all the way through the beak. I've seen leg bands get caught in many, many broken legs. So do be careful. If you're going to be buying toys from the market, try to really inspect them and make sure they're durable enough for the kind of bird you have, and don't have sharp edges, sharp parts that could puncture. I probably seen it all, and anything that can go wrong will go wrong with these things. So you gotta be careful about them.
I think toy, this conversation, it's a good part to add into any education classes you have. Get some toys that are bad and show an adopter, what you would consider a bad toy, or what parts might cause a problem that Lorelei has just mentioned. Just seeing the visual sometimes sets in a little better for a person who's new to this type of need to watch for things like that.
Well, Lorelei, you predicted it, that yes, we're going to talk about reproductive behavior. So maybe you could elaborate on that discussion with some tips for discouraging reproductive behavior. You mentioned, certain toys might encourage nesting. Any other tips?
Yeah, it's a big topic. Birds are reproductive. I guess I should back up and say the reason we don't like to encourage reproductive behavior are, for me, well, there's two reasons. One is behaviorally. People tend to find their birds become a lot more aggressive when they're reproductively active. That's when people get bad bites. It damages the bond with the birds. And again, the last thing we want are for these birds to have to be rehomed because the owners are scared of them. And number two are the health risks involved when these birds are reproductively active, both males and females. I've seen many, many prolapses in male birds that we've had to euthanize because we can't correct them. We've, of course, seen a bazillion egg-bound birds and calcium-depleted birds that are just such prolific egg layers due to stimulation of their reproductive behavior. So the most common things, pitfalls that people fall into are allopreening, basically masturbating their birds that they are not aware of, rubbing them too much on their back and over their sides, excessive grooming of the face and neck, and just being too amorous with the bird. It's a wonderfully bonding experience. We all know that, but if you do it to excess and then during certain seasons, you can cause a lot of problems. Birds need a lot of sleep. I think when people don't have appropriate diurnal cycles for their birds, they are very, very stimulated by the photoperiod. So, if people are awake watching TV, playing with their birds until 11, 12 at night, and then wake up at 6, get the birds up to go to work, that is not enough sleep, and the birds are going to think it's, time to start breeding. It's the springtime, and we do see a lot of reproductive behavior that's induced because they're just not getting enough rest, and the photoperiod is off. I don't know if Janet wants to add to this. There's so many.
There are a lot. I had a long list. I think also if you are handling your bird and start to see demonstrated breeding behavior, so a bird that might start regurgitating to you or doing their little happy dance, whatever, put that bird down. Don't handle it. Don't encourage that behavior so that you can try and nip that in the bud. And then also, Lorelei, you can probably touch on this. I think diets can affect breeding behavior too. So high in fat, protein, and starch. Starchy foods will indicate it's time to start breeding because I have good ability to feed.
I mean, yeah, it's when the environment is right, and they're thinking, oh wow, okay, I've got the best possible food, so my body is capable of making eggs. In many instances now I have a nest available, and I'm getting nonstop allopreening from my chosen mate. That's just the perfect situation for a bird to start laying eggs.
And
I guess
all at once. I just wanted to mention that the reason why, this is brought up, although, as Lorelei mentioned, we could probably have a whole webinar on just this, but that birds can't be spayed and neutered, and we want to not,
Well, they can. It's just a very risky procedure. We do it when we have to, not because of prevention. Just sorry.
Well, no, thanks for the clarification. But it's something that, in the dog and cat world, we take for granted. And, we realize as, a dog and cat community that, we want to prevent overpopulation because there's not enough homes for dogs and cats to go into. And it's risingly that problem for birds, but, for a number of reasons. Birds being wild animals, it's pretty it's borderline whether, we should be putting birds into a home environment, especially those that are wild birds. So it's really only due to pure necessity. There's just not enough capacity at animal sanctuaries like Oasis for birds to go into. So we're putting, birds that, while for GFAS, we encourage a natural existence, but given how many birds that are out there, they're going into homes. And so I just want to emphasize that point when we're talking about reproductive behavior, that, you have to be actively aware of those behaviors so that you can curtail additional new animals coming into the community.
And working with a new adopter who isn't familiar with these behaviors, I think is probably the most important issue. Most birds are relinquished, or owners get fed up at the point when those birds start demonstrating those behaviors, and again, showing that more aggressive personality. So really understanding what to expect any time of year based on the species they have, and how to manage that so that the bird can remain in the home is most important. It can, be a couple of months of pain and a lot of extra work to get a bird through that, and once they get over that need for breeding, they return to their normal happy self, then an owner can get back to being happy family again. But I think that's really important for a new adopter to understand, that there's going to be times when they're going to have to deal with these things, and giving them the tools to work with that through that period is really important. And if they're adopting a bird that's not sexually mature, I think understanding when that point is going to happen, to be prepared, is really important. So, I think most of the birds that are relinquished to the Oasis for aggressive behavior are typically birds that are hitting sexual maturity, and the owner is just at their wits' end because they don't know how to manage it.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, just to move on, this is a great topic, but even more important to think about, yes. Not more important, but equally important, is flight, and how important that is to birds' natural existence. So given our lack of time, we're running short, not surprisingly. Maybe, Janet, could you just add what are your key points that an adopter needs to know about flight?
Well, when I saw this question, my first thought was, well, my 3 key points are health, health, and health. The birds health is dependent on their ability to fly. So we have learned a lot, and Lorelei can certainly touch more on this, about the benefits of flight and long life for a bird. My one point that I've learned over the years is it also helps a bird to really own their birdness. They understand what it means to fly. They're more self-confident. Birds who have been clipped or never learned to fly, or maybe are handicapped and can't fly, tend to be a little more less independent and a little less confident about their abilities to move around, and maybe that could cause injuries for them, which then in turn could cause phobic behavior or feather plucking and mutilation. So really it is a very important psychological impact to the bird as well.
Lorelei, do you have anything to add?
Oh, sure. I mean, flight is by far one of the most important things that I talk to clients about, and a lot of people come to us, they've been trimming their birds for years, and the birds don't even remember or never learned how to fly. But we see so many birds that are, living longer than ever because of better veterinary care and better diets, but they are not getting the exercise that they really should be getting. And we see tons of heart disease in parrots, tons of various liver and lipid disorders from obesity, and not to mention the mental health issues involved with birds that can't fly. And, like Janet was touching on, we see so much feather destructive behavior and self-mutilation, and there's no doubt in my mind that the birds that fly and are encouraged to fly and get proper exercise are much more mentally healthy. And when you take away the one thing that birds are designed to do, it creates so many psychological problems for them. And when you combine that with the physical detriments, I feel so passionately that people's birds should fly. It's not quite, but almost on my list of do not adopt if they must let them fly. And there's a couple of exceptions that I would make for clipping birds' wings. I don't know if we have time to discuss them, but.
Well, I think let's move on and just talk about, I think you both referred to having, the safe environment. So the next question is, would you describe some simple ways that adopters can create a safe free flight zone for birds in their home? Lorelei, since you're...
I think, so it depends on the size of the bird. Like I mentioned, I have a rescued green-winged macaw. I live in a one-bedroom apartment in New York City. I'm incredibly lucky that I do have very high ceilings. But I do, I have to make her fly. She'll sit there all day if I don't force her to, but I will pull her across the room around the corner and force her to fly several times a day. You have to make sure you have proper places for them to land. I think one of the biggest problems we see is that birds crash into things and get hurt. And you need to teach them, like, this is your either play stand or your tea stand, or this is a dresser that I'm okay with you landing on. Make sure that they're taught this is where you can land, so they're not just crashing into walls or mirrors or windows. Smaller birds, this is a lot easier. Because they can get a lot better exercise in smaller spaces, and definitely, I think the obvious things like closing window blinds if you need to, shutting ceiling fans off, making sure toilets aren't flushing, there isn't pots of boiling water, and just making sure that there are not open windows, doors opening and closing, even if it means putting a little note up outside the door saying birds free-flighted, don't enter, or knock first, or whatever you need to do, are good options and I'm, of course, referring to indoor flight, unlike the picture here where that's outdoor, which would be ideal, but assuming most people don't have the ability to do that, have an outdoor aviary, these are just some indoor flight ideas.
Well, and maybe you can touch on, the possibility of unflighted considerations with this question. Are there different safety risks to birds that is flighted versus unflighted? Again, just let Lorelei start with this.
I think what I hear a lot from people when I'm trying to dissuade them from clipping the wings is they say, well, I have a cat or I have a dog, and I am worried that if I let them fly, they'll go over and try to play with them. Well, my argument to this is I would so much rather your bird could fly away from them. I'm much more worried about your bird going to the floor and not being able to get away. And when you put it to people like that, they start to rethink things. But my exceptions to clipping would be if I can assess a situation and understand and believe and can provide follow-up that it's temporary. I think there are some times when birds become aggressive, unruly, dominant, and even just taking a couple of the flight feathers so that they are, I don't know how to say it, but just a little less territorial, a little less aggressive, sometimes is required in order to give an owner a chance to work with the bird and reestablish trust if there's been some biting or aggression issues. And those might be some times where I would agree to do some light trimming. Maybe Janet can expand on that and give her opinions on it.
Yeah, I agree. I actually have an African gray that I did that with. During his terrible twos, he was pretty unruly, and just clipping a few of his flight feathers, he was still able to fly enough that, you know, he could safely get himself somewhere, but he didn't have as much control to finish a mission, so to speak. So he calmed down a little bit. He realized he couldn't be aggressive to me that way. So that did help him through those years. And I think one other really key important point about flight is a lot of folks, especially larger birds who have their flight feathers, who don't demonstrate good flight skills. People will take them outside. Oh, my bird's never flown. We need to really make sure adopters understand that any bird that has flight feathers needs to be secured if they're going outside. Even if they're carrying them to an outside aviary, they need to be in a carrier or on a harness, because all it takes is one scare or gust of wind to take that bird off. And even if they've never flown before, they're going to start flapping, and that bird could well be gone.
Yeah, very good point. Well, and good segue into various hazards. Again, we're now officially running long, so Janet, could you maybe touch on a couple of top hazards for birds? Maybe
top hazards
are not so obvious.
Sure. Not so obvious. Okay, well, maybe mine were pretty obvious. Teflon is certainly one that I think we all know, but new adopters may not be familiar with. And not just Teflon pots and pans, but anything Teflon, irons, curling irons, things like that. Open doors, that's pretty obvious. Other pets, that's a big consideration. We've talked about cats and dogs. Even if a bird is in its cage, it's a sitting duck for a predator. A dog could certainly grab a leg or a wing through a cage bar and injure a bird. So that's a big consideration. And then chemicals, especially if a bird is roaming the home, can get into cabinets and things like that. You want to make sure chemicals and cleaning supplies are secure.
I want to add, those are all awesome and good. We see tons of traumatic injuries from birds just getting sat on, stepped on, and crushed indoors. Birds that people don't realize their bird is sitting on a door and they shut it really quickly and they break both legs or worse. We see something like that probably weekly. People cause a lot of trauma that they, inadvertently when their birds they're not aware their birds are underfoot.
Oh. It's horrible.
I know, it's awful. It is.
So Janet, you kind of touched on this. What do people need to know about interactions with other companion species like dogs and cats? And I'll send it back to you.
My thought is, if there's a house full of dogs and cats, I would not adopt a bird into that household. And Lorelei, I've heard 100 million stories about birds being injured by dogs and cats, and to me, it's just not a risk I would want to take with intermixing those species together.
Totally.
That.
I mean, just 3 days ago, Goffin cockatoo came in. The pit bull got a hold of it for the second time, and it's to me, that's one of those homes I wouldn't adopt to. They're not a good home for a bird. No matter how many times I do see situations where a bird and a cat have lived together and never had a problem. It's just, I always say, until the one time they do. So, and it will happen eventually.
What about other species? Rabbits? Are there other companion species that are good fellow companions for birds?
Well, other exotic animals don't tend to create, I mean, we're talking about predator and prey, so rabbits are not predator species. Reptiles don't tend to cause problems, although you do need to wash your hands in between handling reptiles and birds. Maybe ferrets. I wouldn't put a bird in a home with a ferret, or at least certainly not a small bird that the ferret could get a hold of. Fish would be good.
Good suggestion. We have an adoption prospect with a smoker in the family. How do we deal with this? Lorelei, how do you
I mean, if somebody smokes, they shouldn't have a bird. It gets not only, even if when people tell me, well, I smoke out the window or I go outside to smoke, I can tell the second someone walks in with a bird and I pick the bird up, it's the first thing I smell. And they say, oh, well, I don't even smoke in the apartment. It's because it's on your hands, it's on your clothes, and you're handling the bird, and the tar and the nicotine and the poison and the toxin is going, the second you touch your bird, it gets on their feathers. Birds then preen themselves and they ingest it. If someone smokes, they shouldn't have birds, in my opinion. I try to really encourage people to quit if it's not an adoption situation and I'm just educating them, if not for themselves, then for their birds, because I always tell people I care more about your bird than I care about you. So just quit smoking for your bird.
Well, I guess since we're already running late, I'll have one more question, going back to the cats and dog issue. So would you think that there's any possibility, like, is there any number of cats or dogs, or combination, if it's one dog that's small, or, is there any consideration of, what kind of space those two species might live in that would change your mind?
I think there's always individual situations. If there's a house and the bird lives on the top floor and the dog never goes up there, or the cat never goes up there, I suppose that kind of a situation might work. But there's any dog, small or large, can kill a bird. And cats, even if they're raised since they're kittens, everyone sees those videos on YouTube and how cute they are when the kitten and the budgie are playing together, but that doesn't tend to last. There's always exceptions, I guess.
Yeah, and I think as a rescue group, if you can do a home visit and observe the behavior of those animals, certainly would be a good way to make that decision.
Great point. Yeah. Well, and I know that this hasn't been an exhaustive discussion, but I hope that it gives all of you that are attending a little more information about what are the important things to discuss with potential adopters. Again, I just want to call attention to some additional resources. I mentioned earlier the GFAS Avian Education page. Again, all of our previous webinars are available there. I do want to mention that this is, as I mentioned, the second of our 4-part series on adoption. So in the next few weeks, we'll have 2 more. One will be talking about wills and trusts. Obviously, we're dealing with some long-lived species here. So how do you consider those after you get sick or you pass? You want to make sure that you're prepared for that. Another important adoption question that we're going to be addressing is the adoption contract. So both of those discussions will be led by lawyers. So that gives you a nice opportunity to ask some real legal questions regarding contracts and wills and trusts. Again, Animal Welfare Coalition's shelter resource page has an amazing amount of resources. Here's a few other of their really nice resources on their site. And Denise, did you want to have a final word? Are you still there? Okay, maybe we lost Denise. Well, I'll give you a final word. So, again, we're dealing with wild animals, and we're trying to put them into homes where they can be provided with a long life and the best possible care. But we're trying to give you more information to help you make that possible. But obviously, there's always going to be more questions that you have, and I really advocate for groups to start. And this was our previous topic in this series, is creating a network of resources so that you can ask these questions. People like Janet at sanctuaries or Lorelei at clinics. These are the experts in the field that, when you're in trouble or you have questions or you have adopters that have questions, having those resources available to you, that's something that you should start doing anytime you're considering putting together an avian adoption program. And with that, I will conclude. And I really want to thank our speakers today. They did a great job of answering these questions. And I want to thank Robin Mason with GFAS, who helped put together the presentation with all the questions. And if you had questions that were unanswered, we will distribute those to the speakers so that we can address any unanswered questions. But with that, Robin, did you have any closing housekeeping?
I don't. I think you covered it all. Thanks, Kelly.
Okay, great. Well, everybody have a great day, and we'll see you in a couple weeks at our next webinar.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.